The fall 2025 season of Investigation with Dr. T is proudly centering on our institution's newly designated prestigious R1 Carnegie classification. We're seizing this moment to go deeper, think bigger, and highlight the game-changing work that's happening. So each episode this fall is going to spotlight cutting-edge research initiatives, groundbreaking studies, and powerful doctoral dissertations led by PhD and EDD students, research-engaged faculty, field-based research practitioners, and community partners. So we're going to focus on vital sectors like education, criminal justice, human services, while also welcoming special guests from the College of Psychology, College of Dental Medicine, and the College of Computing and Engineering. And join us as we celebrate our journey into R1 territory and explore what it truly means to lead with research, lead with scholarship, and lead with purpose. So stay tuned. Fall 2025 Investigation with Dr. T. It's going to be unforgettable. And so tonight we have Dr. Grace Telesco and Dr. Dana Mills with us for a very special edition. And let me give you Dr. Mills' bio. He is an Associate Dean of Research and Program Planning and Assistant Professor at the Fischler College of Education and School of Criminal Justice at Nova Southeastern University. His research centers on community-based solutions to complex social issues, with a particular focus on veterans reintegration and alternative therapeutic approaches. Through grant-funded projects, Dr. Mills is exploring innovative interventions such as scuba diving, I want to hear about that later, and simulation-based experiences, very close to my heart also, as potential supports for veterans returning to the workforce. In addition, his applied research addresses psychoeducational health services for individuals experiencing homelessness, emphasizing the translation of evidence-based practice into real-world community settings. Dr. Mills has published widely and led national trainings in program eval and program planning. Earlier in his career, Dr. Mills completed a postdoc fellowship through the National Institute on Drug Abuse at the University of Miami, helped launch the South Florida Education Research Alliance, a partnership among multiple universities and Broward County Public Schools. He earned his PhD in psychology from the University of Rhode Island. Welcome, Dr. Mills. Also, they're not saying this in the bio, but it's also true. We know this from last week, that you are also instrumental in Razor's Edge, right?
Yeah, I am. Yeah. First, thank you, Grace. It's an honor to be here today, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. As someone, as you said, who's kind of spent their career studying trauma and resilience and first responders and veterans, I'm constantly reminded of the impact that September 11th has. And I think the one thing that hopefully will reinforce to people is that it didn't end that day. I mean, this should not be a day where we just reflect, but it's something that continues to live in all of us every day, but certainly for those who were there and those who were most impacted. So I'm really glad that you have chosen this as a topic to reflect on tonight, and so that we can show not only the courage and those things that we saw in those individuals who were first responders, but then also some of the hidden costs that are lingering right now today. So it is an absolute pleasure to be here, and yes, I'm super proud to be a part of the Razors Research Program and hopefully instill in these folks some of these same values of using research-based principles to solve real problems.
Yes, thank you again for saying yes. I wanted to partner with somebody tonight. I didn't want to just do this by myself, even though I can talk a lot about 9/11, the year and a half that I spent at Ground Zero working with the families in the, not rescue as much as the recovery and emotional recovery efforts. But if I had to think of any one person that I'd like to ask, it was you. And I so appreciate that you were willing to step up and do that with me. So we're going to talk a little bit about 9/11. We're going to talk a little bit about the deleterious outcomes that first responders have experienced even though it's 24 years later. So this is a very special edition of Investigation with Dr. T, the anniversary of September 11th. And we pause not only to remember, but to reflect deeply on the lasting impact of that day. For me personally, I was a lieutenant in the NYPD. On this day, I was there when the first plane hit the first tower. And interestingly, I mean, ironically, I was teaching at John Jay College of Criminal Justice as an adjunct, and I was teaching a crisis intervention using theater techniques course that morning. And so my class started at 9 o'clock. It was September 11th, so it was like 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 3 weeks into the semester. And the lesson for the day was supposed to be talking about the characteristics of a crisis. It's just mind blowing, right? So, I come out of the Battery Tunnel in my lieutenant unmarked car because as a lieutenant, you got an unmarked car where I worked anyway out of headquarters, and I worked for community affairs. And so being right there when the first plane hit, we looked up. I looked up at the sky, and there was this glitter that was coming down, and I was like, "What is that? It's just weird. It's like a parade or something." I was with my spouse, and we were just like, "What's going on?" And then I saw that there was fire coming out of like the 100th floor or something. And I said, "Oh, wow, it's like an office fire up there or something." And I see fire trucks. And that was it. It was just like two fire trucks right in front of the World Trade Center. And then, like the rest is history, right? So we know I call this never forget, sometimes forgotten, often haunted. And the reason that I call it that, and actually that's the name of a an article that I wrote pretty recently, talking about how even though it's 24 years later, some of us still experience the triggers. We still come from this trauma reaction. Before the show started, I was talking about sometimes if I see a construction truck or a crane or a tractor or something like that, it immediately will trigger me about ground zero. Even on our property here, we have 5 acres and there's a lot of trees. And there's this one particular spot on the property where there's like these two stumps of a tree. And I always remark that reminds me of the towers right there. So it's just like these triggers that we live with, that we are haunted with. And I know that we've both studied or worked closely with first responders. And I think one of the things that I'd like to start with tonight is, 2 decades later, what are the lasting psychological and physical impact that 9/11 has had on those who ran toward danger? So if you don't mind, Dr. Mills, I'm going to show this PowerPoint, just really kind of talk about these three studies. One is mine, and two others are longitudinal studies that were done. So if you don't mind, I'm going to just pivot to that for a minute and just kind of talk about my research first. I'm hoping everybody can see that. So this was published, this was written 6 months after the work stopped at Ground Zero with my cops, with my guys. Again, through community affairs, we basically took families from the 9/11 command center. We took them there by boat, three boat trips a day, about 50 family members each trip. And the reason we took them by boat, by ferry, is because you couldn't get down there. You couldn't get down to the ground zero area. Um, you could only do it by boat at that time, right? And we're talking about September 11th, literally, and then the 12th and the 13th and the 14th, and the weeks and months that followed. And so the work really began on September 11th in small ways at the morgue first, and then it moved to the Armory on Lexington Avenue, and then it ultimately moved to the Upper West Side on the river, and in a big command center that we had, like a big warehouse that was made into a family assistance center. And so for a year and a half, the work was being done on small and large scales, right? So I say that because I intimately became involved with the families. And even though you say, well, there were thousands of people that were killed, that died that day, in the beginning, we didn't know how many people had died. And in fact, one family member, two family members, 10 family members were going to the Family Assistance Center to prepare missing persons reports. So, in other words, for one victim, there might have been 10 family members that were not even coordinating or communicating with each other, but were going down to the family center to fill out these missing person reports. So the chaos, and I think that Dr. Mills and I were talking about this also before we started to go live, and that was that there was just complete and total chaos and a feeling of the end of the world. And I always tell this story. I was coming down 7th Avenue. It was after the towers had fallen already. And I was coming down 7th Avenue on my way to headquarters and to basically suit up into my uniform and grab a radio. But on the way, I wanted to see where the mobilization point was because, I mean, this was the end of the world as we knew it, kind of, right? For those of us in New York and those of us in the NYPD and the fire department. And so I'm flying down 7th Avenue in my lieutenant unmarked car, and I pull over because there's a uniformed cop on the corner. And I identify myself, Lieutenant Telesco. I'm from headquarters. Do me a favor, could you go on the citywide band and tell me where the mobilization point is? And the cop says, Lieutenant, take my radio. I said, no, I don't want your radio. Just go to the citywide band and tell me where's the mobilization. Is it under the Manhattan Bridge? Is it under the Brooklyn? Like, where is it? He said, Lieutenant, this is the end of the world. I don't need my radio. And he handed me his radio. And I took the radio. I took it. I took the radio. And 6 months later, I got it back to that cop. But 24 years later, I realized that this poor kid was in shock. And so many of us were, but we're sort of just going through the motions and acting as if, doing the job, doing whatever it was we had to do, whether it was interfacing with families, taking reports, helping people go back over to the Brooklyn Bridge, because remember that there was sort of this escape for those who were at the Ground Zero site were running for their lives, basically. And so there was rescue and recovery efforts, and it was recovery of physical, spiritual, and emotional. So 6 months after the work had stopped, I partnered with one of my mentors at Fordham University, Haya Petrikowski, and we looked at the impact that 9/11 and exposure to 9/11 had on these officers. And so we all know there were 3,000 people that were killed. The NYPD was pretty much front and center assisting victims and families, not just at Ground Zero, but at the morgue and at local hospitals as well. The psychological toll has really largely been unstudied. I'm going to share two other studies, two other research projects, that longitudinal projects that were done. But basically, what's still been unstudied and not really known is the psychological outcomes 20 something years later, right? Like we all know, like 6 months later, and that's what this my first study was about, was 6 months after, looking at the exposure of 200 community affairs officers and what was their role? To escort families, DNA collection through saliva, death certificates, and offering not only condolences, but psychological first aid. And many were untrained in this area, right? There was 12 to 15-hour shifts, 7 days a week. There was a point after October where we started to give days off, right? The redeployment ended January 2002. So for this study with Dr. Petrikowski, my mentor from Fordham University, the research questions were: what's the extent of the PTSD symptoms? Did exposure predict severity? Did gender or ethnicity matter? and did years of service matter. And the method was it was not a random sample. It was a purposive sample, if you will, non-random. 74 officers. Their average age was 39 years old. 64% were female, 42% African American, 22% Hispanic. We used the PCL, which is a post-traumatic symptom checklist, reliable, with a cutoff of more than 50 possible PTSD, and data collection was done March 2002. So the mean score was 36.3, ranging from 18 all the way up to 80. 23% screen positive for PTSD. That's way above what the regular population percentage is for PTSD in the general population. Hispanic officers really scored high with 53% noting PTSD symptoms. African American officers, 6.5. The gender trend was that females were higher, but it wasn't significant. And years of service had no effect. So, you say to yourself, when you're looking at empirical data, you go, this is common sense. There was greater distress than ground zero officers. They were unprepared for emotional labor, unprepared for the secondary trauma, and a lot of vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue was not necessarily measured here, but PTSD was, depression was. So some of the recommendations that came out of it: emotional preparedness training, they didn't have any. Limit shifts, we tried to, but when you're in what feels like combat, all bets are off. So there was very little respite for the officers that were involved down at Ground Zero, and specifically at the Family Assistance Center. There needs to be some routine PTSD and depression and substance abuse screening, and we don't do that. We do substance abuse screening in the NYPD through what's called a random urine analysis. So it's random. You can come in for that day. You don't know, you have no idea, and they pick your number, and now you have to go provide a sample, a urine sample, to determine if there's any substance in your system, illegal substances. Another recommendation is early culturally responsive intervention. And I don't have enough time tonight to talk about what happened to us as the first responders at Ground Zero in terms of peer support or critical incident stress debriefing. I don't have time for that. Maybe another show we can do that. We could talk about that. But I could tell you that the early intervention for us didn't really happen. Another recommendation within like first responders and police specifically is to normalize mental health care. And we don't do that, right? So the conclusion of this study is that 1 in 5 officers showed possible PTSD 6 months post 9/11. Family assistance roles were uniquely traumatic, uniquely traumatic. So these officers may have seen images, but not like those who were on what would be called the bucket brigade, for example, or the fresh kills, the landfill, where a lot of the debris from Ground Zero, including remains, was being shipped over to Fresh Kills in Staten Island. And there were detectives and officers that were assigned to sifting through the debris and sifting through the remains. Now you could see how that would be extremely traumatic. Our guys, my guys, the guys that worked for me, they were family assistance specific. So they worked with the families directly. I wanted to take a look real quick at another study, right? This is MAN 2025. It's current. It's a longitudinal cohort study of PTSD in World Trade Center responders. Here's the objectives of this study. It investigated 20-year PTSD symptom trajectories in World Trade Center responders. PTSD remains a chronic and costly condition, as we know. 9/11 responders were exposed to extreme trauma. Previous studies were limited in duration and frequency. I mean, my own study was limited. It wasn't longitudinal. It was cross-sectional, right? And it's like, oh, damn, wouldn't it have been great if we could have, followed them. But there are other studies, like this one in particular, that comes from the World Trade Center registry that looks at the longitudinal deleterious outcomes, if any. They examined 20-year symptom trajectories in 12,822 responders, and we're looking at stability, looking at, was there improvement? Was it worsening? Were there any predictors of long-term PTSD? So these methods, again, all World Trade Center responders like myself, however, not necessarily just police officers. Important, to note. The period was from July 2002 to 2022 with 17 follow-ups. They used the PTSD checklist as well, and it was mixed models regression. I thought that this was really interesting to show the demographics and the breakdown. And what I found in particular to be really interesting, it's a 75% white sample. It's 63% law enforcement. So even though it includes others, the bulk is police officers. So the key findings here is that PTSD prevalence 8 to 15% across 20 years. My study was higher, 23%, but that was 6 months after. So this is 20 years later. Symptoms peaked around 10 years post 9/11 with a modest decline afterward. Half of PTSD cases improved after 9 years, 76% improved by 20 years. I highlighted this because they're singing my song. 49% experienced worsening, higher, 66% among PTSD cases. So it worsened as time went on. Symptom stability findings here, 10% remained highly symptomatic. What are some of the implications? PTSD is chronic. Improvement and deterioration can take years. Demographic differences are small. Occupation and exposures matter more. Functional impairments are common in high symptom trajectories, mental and physical. And high mental health costs in severe cases can run up to $1,800 per person annually. So what's the need? Long-term monitoring, personalized interventions, and sustained treatment access. This final study that I also thought was really, really cool, 15 years after the disaster, self-medication, 9/11 related PTSD and alcohol, also singing my song. So what first responders have a tendency to do is self-medicate. And so the background here was PTSD was the most common mental health outcome after 9/11. Prevalence, again, was 3.8 to up to 29%, depending on the population. Alcohol consumption rises after disasters and trauma, and we know that. And self-medication, alcohol was used to cope with PTSD symptoms. This also comes from the World Trade Center registry, which I was talking to Dr. Mills before the show, and I was saying that I'm part of the National World Trade Center Responder Program. That means that every year I get annual checkups for my lungs, make sure that I don't have 9/11 related lung cancer, EKG, make sure my heart is okay, and then they ask a lot of psychological questions. And from those questions come these findings. The sample included 28,935 individuals who were exposed to 9/11. Again, the PTSD checklist was used, and the self-medication of alcohol was defined as using alcohol to cope with the symptoms. A logistic regression was used. What's the findings? 20% reported this intentional self-medication. I think that's pretty serious, right? Self-medication with alcohol was linked with hyperarousal and avoidance symptoms. 15 years after 9/11, survivors are still coping with PTSD, and they're doing it in a negative way with alcohol. The implications, again, for need for repeated screening, psychoeducation, interventions targeting PTSD and substance abuse, and the importance of addressing maladaptive coping in disaster-exposed populations. So that's a lot. Dr. Mills, please come on. What's your take on these three studies as a researcher, as a scientist? You look at these studies, and what's your takeaway, your major takeaway, if any?
You know, sure. So, so one thing that all these things have in common is, obviously is the stress of dealing with this. So one thing that we know is that stress is bad, right? I mean, we know kind of the stereotypical type A personality and that, people that have that type of personality are more susceptible to heart attacks, right? So this is just for the average, everyday American that we want to control our stress. And the reason that we want to control our stress is that there's a cumulative burden that stress creates. And the term that we use in psychology is called the allostatic load. And one thing that we know is once you've reached that allostatic load, so your body is kind of overwhelmed with stress, we know that things like early aging occur. Okay, so folks will die younger. They literally will not only look older, but their body will age at such a rate that their heart, their major organs will ultimately stop functioning at the same level that they should given their chronological age. So life expectancy is lowered, and in these populations that experience PTSD, that's one thing that we know. In addition to that, things like it does lead to that allostatic load does lead to immune system dysfunction, to metabolic dysregulation, to emotional dysregulation. So there's a lot of other issues that are involved in addition to some of those mental health issues. So not only is it that you're going through the some of the psychological trauma, but then physically you're also experiencing issues. And so if you look at exacerbating that with self-medicating with alcohol, not seeking treatment, it's great that we have a place for the 9/11 folks to go, that this World Trade Center coalition that does those health screenings. I would guess that not everybody's going there. A lot of one thing that we know, particularly with men in general, is that they're not very good about maintaining neither their physical nor their psychological health. And so these problems are just exacerbated. And then, as I was starting to say, you add alcohol abuse on top of it. We know that's not healthy for you to begin with the additional stress, it's just a recipe for disaster. And so there's just so many, negative, physical health consequences that come from this that have nothing to do even with the issues that are very real in this population that you alluded to earlier, cancer, emphysema, some of those other issues from being in that environment that was so heavily involved with toxins. So just a really difficult challenge to deal with these things. The only way to is to stay on top of these things. And again, a lot of individuals just simply don't.
Yeah, I mean, I for one, I think talked about this a little bit before we went live. Also, is while I was involved in the work as the lieutenant, and in charge of the whole thing, the interagency coordinator for mental health services was my official title. Um, Everything was fine until the work stopped. Then when the work stopped and I retired in 2003, the world, that's when the world got very small for me. And the self-medicating piece, and I was reluctant because, look, my PhD is in social work. I have a mental health specialization. I thought I was handling everything pretty good, but I wasn't. I wasn't handling anything good. Not when the work stopped. And so then they had this program where you could go get help. So I went because I recognized that there was a lot of self-medicating going on. I was feeling I couldn't sleep. Insomnia it was very bad. I was grinding my teeth so bad. I was needing root canals like every week. It felt like it was bad, right? So I went for help, but they wanted to just prescribe medication and they want to just throw medication at you. And so now if you're self-medicating and now you've got your hands on this medication and you're playing around and experimenting with it, this is just like a time bomb that's ready to go off. And I think that for first responders and particularly those in leadership positions, it's really hard. It's hard to say, Uncle, I surrender. I can't. You know what I mean?
Well, you're raised to not do that, right? I mean, that the job doesn't allow you to do that. I mean, you can't do that. I mean, you're running literally into the fire or towards the danger. So there's a warrior culture that's created there that is is reinforced. You can't make it in those careers as a, EMS, firefighter, police officer if you're not willing to, to do that. And so what ends up happening is once that you're removed from that warrior culture, you don't know how to react. And that's part of it. The other piece, and I'll just kind of tease this a little bit, is, and you alluded to it, that when you would seek some type of assistance and we're looking for that type of counseling, one thing we know is that it's very difficult, when you have that warrior mentality, to go sit down and process your feelings. It's difficult for anybody to do. It's exceptionally difficult for folks that come with that mentality. And so one of the things that, as you introduced me and read my bio, one of the things that we've done is developed alternative therapeutic approaches that are not traditional therapy. So you're not going in there and, sitting on the proverbial couch and talking about your feelings, but you have other ways to gain confidence, to reduce stress. The term that we use in our therapeutic lab is stress inoculation therapy, where we literally kind of teach you, through small doses, just like any other inoculation, right? We inject you with a vaccine to build your resistance to higher levels of a dose response to a virus. It's kind of like what we're doing with stress and its impact on you psychologically. So we kind of train you through low levels of stress introduction and environments that are not threatening, that are different, like scuba diving, like driving in a race car simulation. And we kind of teach you how to process this information. The whole impetus for that was exactly as you said. We've heard this time and time again, from folks that come from jobs, veterans and first responders that are kind of engaged in that warrior culture. I don't want to sit down and talk about it. This person doesn't understand me, number one, and number two, I don't want to take those medications. I can kind of do that on my own, or it doesn't work, or I don't like the way it makes me feel. It's very negative, and so that's really the impetus for why we developed the programs that we did, and we hopefully will be able to start to make a bit of a difference.
That's awesome. Scuba diving. I love that. And it's so true. I mean, I'm a diver, myself. And, when you get that depth and you can be in the worst waters. I used to dive in New York City, which, the visibility was like 1 foot, if that. And, there's like very, very rough waters at the surface, but when you descend, there's this peace that happens. It's like going to the depth of yourself kind of thing. So I can really see how scuba diving would really be beneficial. Hey, listen, so is equine therapy. So that's one of the reasons that I moved, was so that I could have a horse, and on my property, and then I could be with the horse every single day. It's the only thing that seems to really, really help take the edge off, right?
Yeah, and we all have something, and I think that's the key, right? Is like tapping that, and the idea, just to you mentioned the feeling that you get when you are diving. Well, what happens physiologically is your heart rate drops, your oxygen level increases. You have to maintain, a steady breathing because you'll run out of oxygen in your oxygen tank if you don't.
Right.
That's if I were to teach you meditation or mindfulness, yoga, it's the same thing, right? So now I can't get a guy who's used to being in the battlefield or storming into to a fiery building. I can't get them to sit down and say we're going to think and we're going to meditate and we're going to live. I can't get them to do that. I can get them to dive, and because it's fun and it's exciting. But what they don't know is that I'm teaching them the same exact skills. And those skills are self-regulation. It's how do I slow everything down so that I can get down deep, enjoy. There is something kind of zen about that atmosphere. And so that's how it works. So that's kind of the magic there. So we kind of trick them, right? It's like we tell them, no, we're going to do this, like, give it this awesome opportunity to get scuba certified just because, we like you and you were a veteran or first responder, but we know what's happening physiologically is changing their brain chemistry.
Yeah,
And ultimately, then you can utilize exactly, as you said, equine therapy is another great example. Art therapy is another great example where you're so focused that it's difficult then for you. The human mind can't focus on too many things at once. And the
that's right.
problem is we start thinking on the bad stuff. That's why you couldn't sleep at night, right? You start to ruminate. So we want to shift that. And when you're thinking about these other things, then your body has a chance to relax. We can reduce that allostatic load, reduce stress, and ultimately improve your life.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I find that on the horse when I'm on the horse, there's nothing going on. The chatter in my head goes away
Right.
completely because I have to be, I have to be breathing. I have to be sitting up straight in a certain way. I have to, there's just all these different techniques that I have to engage. And you're right, I don't have time to be thinking about anything else. And so it's really wonderful. I think we kind of hit on the personal piece of this, like that this is not just an academic conversation, that this is personal. It's personal for so many. And we're talking about resilience and healing and the hidden cost of service. One of the things that I said to you before we started the live stream was that for many, many years, I walked around feeling victimized by 9/11. I would talk about it. I would say I was a first responder, blah, 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 go into the story of it, tell the story. But I was coming from a place of pain around it. And then something shifted in me, whether it be because a spiritual technique or spiritual belief system or whatever it might be. But something shifted when I started to place meaning on the work, when I started to realize that this actually was a gift, not a curse. That this was actually an amazing opportunity to be able to help others. Like that I was placed in this position, which, I mean, I don't even feel like it was through any like greatness on my part, but it just right place, right time kind of thing where the universe was really like saying, Grace, we need you to do this, to rise to the occasion and be with these families. I mean, and some of these families I'm still in touch with, and many of my cops that work with me and my sergeants are still in touch with me. And today we communicate. We always communicate every year. So, making meaning of the work. What is there any empirical data on that?
There is, yeah, and I think part of the, there's a couple things there. One issue, and we see this with veterans a lot, is that because they feel the same way. They feel that when they get back, that the mindset is that you're just going to move on. Now you just move on and you have a life where you're just reintegrated back and there's no issue. And for first responders, there's something very similar. And the problem is that that's a difficult thing to do, and you do get a little bit lost in the kind of the emotional toll that this has played. The other piece, and I thought this was really, was really interesting, was that oftentimes, again, in this warrior culture, you're kind of regarded for those things that you did, like the actions that you took, not the actual humans that were behind those that you saved. So it's like, wow, you ran into that burning building, or you showed up in this this dangerous situation, and went out there and you kicked some serious butt. What they don't see is you change the life of somebody else, and sometimes it's difficult for those for those those first responders to, and they need to be reminded of that you save somebody's life, and now their life is very different. Now that you have generations that have been sustained because you showed up, and it's difficult. It sounds like you had that epiphany, that something kind of brought that on upon you. But for others, it's difficult for them to kind of get there. And a part of it is because of the way that we in society kind of regard them as these heroes. I know last week you spoke to, actually, to one of my students, Grant, who talked about EMS workers and some of the challenges that they face early in their career with PTSD when they show up to an accident and they see kind of a horrific scene, bad car accident, or something that's really traumatic that they haven't seen before. And it's the same process for them, that they get real gung ho about the action, and they're kind of adrenaline junkies, and they don't even have time to self-reflect on what have I actually done here? Like I've actually changed the direction of somebody's life. Not to make this too much about me, but the only thing I can relate it to is I had some health issues back a couple of years ago that required an ambulance ride, and I was pretty nervous. It was a cardiac issue that I didn't know how it was going to work out. Fast forward about 8 months, I was at the gym, and the paramedic that took care of me was in there. And I walked up to him. I'm like, I know you. And he looked at me. He's like, not sure I know who you are. And I was like, you were the paramedic. You know, I explained it. He's like, yeah, actually, I kind of remember. And I was like, you may have saved my life. Like that's something that, I'll never forget. And his reaction was, I thought he was just going to be like, hey man, like have a good day. And this, you could see kind of the emotion in him, like, wow, like he doesn't think about it that way. Right. I mean, to him, it's just like on to the next one. And I do think that we need to do, we as in, our society, the way that we interact with these folks, we need to remind them of that. Like, hey, all this stuff that you're going through, is it, number one, it's real, but number two, it's not all for naught. Like there's something that you did that has tremendous value that needs to be, highly regarded. And, we need to be sure that we recognize individuals for that. I think when you can reach that level, and it sounds like this what happened for you, it does shift. It allows you to then kind of be a little bit more at peace with some of the other stuff that you had to deal with.
Right, exactly. And knowing that we were there for people at a time in their lives where there were no answers. I mean, there were so many families that never got remains, right? So and I hate the word closure because it doesn't apply ever, but for them to memorialize their loved one, they didn't even have anything that they could bury. They didn't have anything that they could, go visit, for example. And that's why the trips to Ground Zero by boat, by ferry, were so important and became ritualized as like this thing. And the interesting thing is that there's no pictures of this. Like anytime you see anything about 9/11, you never hear this part of it. And that's because we did a really good job of not allowing anybody to take pictures ever. And so we were like really, that was my number one mission, was not to have our families exploited, and to give them the decency and the privacy, and the intimacy of the moment of being at Ground Zero so that they could see what it looked like, because there was a lot of denial in families. The other thing that I want to just point out is that not only were we struggling, myself included, with PTSD, but this compassion fatigue. I mean, that's big, right? There was a lot of that was happening, where you were empathic and caring and treating these families as if they were your own. Um, and even to the point sometimes of I gave them my own personal cell phone number. It's one of the reasons why I still have a 917 number. I never want to get rid of that number, because so many of my families had that number, and we're still reaching out. Just to reach out. So I think that there was such beautiful work that was done, but it came at a cost. And you talked about that there's greater awareness now, and many first responders still struggle to get adequate recognition for or care for long-term mental health issues linked to 9/11. And so what barriers do you see? And I know you're going to be on the show later on in November to talk about your work, your research with veterans, and the work that you're doing with veterans. And there's a lot of similarities between us and vets. But what barriers do you see, where we still need to change policy or practice?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll preface this by saying actually our work is actually expanding now. We actually are going to be working now with first responders because of those parallels that you described, because it is very similar. And I think there are a few things that we could do. Certainly some of the barriers are, as with anything else, there are a lot of bureaucratic hurdles for benefits, and that's always been an issue. I mean, we were fortunate to have somebody like a John Stewart, who's kind of a high profile TV personality who did a good job in being an advocate for some of those services for first responders. There's a part of me that's like, it's absurd that we needed to have somebody like that make so much noise to do this. I think that we all just need to make that type of noise, and making sure that mental health support is provided in addition to the physical health support, because a lot of times that mental health support is a little underfunded. Definitely that cultural stigma, kind of that suck it up mentality is something that we need to help, get through. And so, developing alternative approaches to the therapeutic process are really important there. looking at maybe even integrating mental health into standard occupational health programs as it relates to the way that we care for for folks in these jobs that are so high stress is incredibly important. And then training the leaders in police and fire agencies to normalize that care seeking, right? So that they can make that referral and say, hey, it's okay. We can, if you're struggling with these kinds of things, we're here to take care of you. Now, there are some really good progressive police departments and fire departments where we're starting to see a little bit of that. It's been really great. And so, hopefully we'll start to see more of that as time goes on. But yeah, not enough good examples out there of what we need to do, but some, and it does appear as though it's expanding.
I have a final question for you and for me, I'll chime in, but for younger generations, so I'm 65 years old, right? So that was at the end of my career, 9/11. 24 years ago. Like that's 20, just think about it. 24 years ago, there were the folks that we're teaching right now, my freshmen, let's say, they weren't alive. They weren't alive yet. So it's history, but it's not their memory, right? How do we ensure that the sacrifices and the lessons learned, particularly about first responders' mental health, aren't lost over time? And as scholars and practitioners, what steps do you believe are most urgent now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have two kids who were neither of which were born, on September 11th, and it was a huge pivotal, moment for me as a 27-year-old at the time. And I think, the one thing that we need to do is to understand that it's history, for younger people. It's not a memory, but there are things that we can do to help, really make the connection for youth. One is when we're teaching this stuff to emphasize the human stories, right? Much in the same ways that we did reading the Diary of Anne Frank as a kid, to kind of humanize the Holocaust. I think there's ways that we can do that by telling some of these oral histories here, these personal narratives, inviting people in to tell their stories, people like you and others who were there, no question about that. The other thing is linking some of the contemporary crises that we've been engaged in over the last few years that that our kids have lived through, things like the wildfires in California, where you were dealing with fire departments from literally from all over the country that were trying to contain those fires, and the impact that it had on them, a really frustrating, difficult time, and kids have seen that. We all lived through the pandemic, right? That's 5 years ago, and we know the toll that took on frontline healthcare workers and a lot of first responders. The hurricanes that we had, thinking most recently in North Carolina, or any of the floods that we had in Texas. These were real events where real people were affected, and so when you tie the kind of these events that our kids are living through and say, hey, this was that even more so because all of us felt like that police officer whose radio you took, where we all sat around thinking, is this it? I mean, it's funny, at the time I had just moved to Florida. I'd been in Florida for just a few months. I moved in July of 2001. And the immediate thought that came through my head is, I'll never see my family again. My family lives up in the Northeast, and that's it. Like, life as we know it has now shifted significantly, and those are kind of the first things that go through your head. That's definitely true when you experience a flood, when you experience a fire, everything you own is destroyed. This is the same thing. My life's over. Everything that I've owned is now gone, and now I don't know what I'm going to do. And so I think making those linkages is a really important piece, and really emphasizing that mental health message to young people as well. That the price of service is ongoing care. It's not one-time praise. It's not on September 11th we get together and we all say never forget and we move on, but we live it, and that we understand that this is ongoing, and it's not only ongoing for those individuals, but then all the other first responders that came after them and all that they've experienced as well. And so kind of using this as like the guide, or the lighthouse in the murky bay, where it's like that's where we're headed. We need everybody to see this and to pay attention to this and make real change.
Yes, wonderful, wonderful. Dr. Mills, I'm so thrilled that you said yes to partner with me tonight. It's really been it's been moving, healing, and I'm so grateful that we have 10 minutes left to just really dedicate to the questions. There's a lot of questions in the webinar, and there's maybe some questions also on YouTube. So I'm going to ask my students to come on, both Ethan and Eddie. I don't know who's going to be doing what, who's taking care of what. You know, Eddie is a project manager, my right hand, and gonna spotlight him. So Eddie, are you you're dealing with the webinar questions?
Well,
Or
so there
YouTube?
are no questions on the YouTube. So
Okay,
we're both going to be reading webinar questions.
fabulous, fabulous. So ask away.
Okay. Dave Blair asked, in what ways do you think that 9/11 changed the way that American people view the importance of public safety?
You want me to handle that one?
Yeah, I mean, I could certainly, I'd like to hear your perspective, actually. It's a good question. I would say that, definitely, um, little things, right? I mean, the security in a lot of locations changed forever. And again, this is difficult for people to understand if they didn't experience it, right? I mean, you used to be able to walk into an airport, walk through security, and whether you had a ticket or not, you could go hang out at the gate if you were, seeing a loved one off or something like that. It was much different. You could bring your food and your water and all that. So there were a lot of little things that happened that you just don't even realize. Like the whole world changed very significantly. I think in addition to that, kind of the physical things that changed, is it changed us in the way that we think about it. And I think not in a paranoid sort of way, but a more alert way that, hey, we're all kind of in this together and we all need to protect each other. And you see some of this sometimes silly, with viral videos that go on. But when you see somebody kind of acting out on an airplane or something like that, I'm always amazed at the people that kind of jump in or are like, hey, we got this. Like, we're not going to allow something like this to happen while we're here. And, it's not that you're getting a bunch of, law enforcement and military guys are doing it. They're just average, everyday people like me who now feel a little bit more sense of kind of like personal responsibility to take care of others. That's kind of like maybe a positive outcome. But yeah, I'm interested to hear your response as well, Grace.
I mean, look, in 9/11, it's everybody can point to that and say, here's all our anti-terrorism strategies and, Homeland Security. And I'm not mocking it in any way, but I'm going to say, but yet every week we hear about shootings and we hear about, school gun violence. It's almost commonplace now. So when we talk about public safety, I don't know. I mean, I think violence is permeating this society. And, the police are charged with what? Cleaning it up, reacting to it, preventing it, mitigating it, responding to it. But there's a deeper problem at play here. And I think it's a psychological problem. And that this is a symptom, the violence, the homicides, this is a symptom of a society in pain and hurting and not getting the care that they need. So that's what happens when you don't take care of your people. I don't know if that answered your question, Dave. It's probably not what you wanted to hear. But let's, Eddie, give me another question. And Dave is actually a research methods student, no, excuse me, graduate orientation seminar PhD in criminal justice student. Go ahead, Eddie. Fire away.
Um, so Ebony asked, Dr. T, what helped you cope with the immediate aftermath and the long-term emotional impact of being actively a part of such an event? Also, as a supervisor, how did you make those critical decisions under such that extreme pressure?
Thank you. Good question. Uh, as I said before, like a year and a half involved in the work, immersed in the work, and anybody who knows me knows I'm a little bit of a workaholic. So I get involved in the work, and that feeds my adrenaline. So while I was involved in the work, I wasn't even aware that it was impacting me. But it was when it stopped, when the work stopped and I retired is when I fell into a pretty bad psychological state. It wasn't pretty. But I still was functioning. That's the thing about, I think that's the thing about first responders too, is this like, it's hidden. Like we don't say it out loud and nobody might know it except that people really, really close to us would know that we're hurting pretty badly. So I still was teaching, I was still doing everything that I had to do, but I was miserable inside. My spirit, it was like termites had eaten at my soul over time. It was just really not good. And it wasn't until, as I said, the healing really started to take place when I made meaning of the work. And what about being a supervisor? It was my job to make sure that my cops got breaks. My cops, every morning, we would assemble right before roll call in a circle, and we called it the circle of trust. And I asked them how they were doing, and each person shared very, very deeply and very, very honestly. And that was every day we did that. I made sure that they got breaks. I made sure that they didn't go on every single boat trip. I made sure that they had time off when they could get time off. Now I didn't do that for myself, however, you see, because I think that I'm the only one who could do everything right, perfectly. So I had to go on every boat trip and I didn't want to take any days off. And so that's why I think, I really suffered from the work because of that. But as a supervisor, it was my job to model what needed to get done and also to take care of them. How about a question to Dr. Mills? We still have some time. Let's want to do one more?
Yes. Okay. Jamie McCarthy asked, do you feel confident that future first responders will get the support they deserve?
That's an
I certainly hope so. I think that it's, the burden is on, I think a couple of different areas. One is it's on people like me, right, to develop therapeutic interventions that will be, seen well, number one, that'll be tested and shown to be effective, but then also, seen as being, directions that this population will want to pursue. And so some of it is we certainly need to do more of that. And I think the second thing is that goes along with that is that we work with both, the law enforcement community and in our case also with, with the military and really talking about the importance of this. I was actually fortunate enough to meet with some folks up in Fort Bragg, North Carolina last year. That's the largest military base in the country. It's like a city. There's 80,000 people there when you go there with families and everything else. And we met with the general who was in charge of Fort Bragg, along with some of his top commanding officers, to talk about reintegration back into society and the changes that need to be made. And they're interested in looking at doing that and better ways to do this, where they do some screening and referral to services before they actually exit. There's something similar that needs to be done in law enforcement, where we do have periodic checks, as I said before, in addition to your physical, right? I mean, we wouldn't want people on the job if they're suffering from some chronic back injury or a knee problem or something like that. We'd want to either get fixed up, or we would think of ways to to get them to retire or do something to take care of them. We need to think of the same, we need to do the same thing for them psychologically as well. And so I think we're making headway. I think it's getting better. My view, not fast enough. I think we need to do that faster. And the burden on some of that is on people like me. People who have the expertise and the knowledge that they can devote to this area to develop the treatments that are necessary.
Yes, yes. There's a comment here that I would just want to highlight, underscore. And I know who it's from. I'm not gonna reveal his true identity, but he says it's somewhat paradoxical that we're striving to keep in our memory trauma that touched us so deeply, but in the end, it's the nature of life. We must remember in order to avoid repeating our mistakes. And so it's really true. It's like, on this day, every day for 24 years. I do not turn the TV on. I do not want to look at any news. I do not want to see burning buildings and people jumping out of buildings. And I don't want to see any of that. I can't. I can't. I try to stay off social media as much as I possibly can today because I don't want to remember the trauma. It's true. So it is sort of like this double-edged sword. Like we don't want to forget, but we maybe should forget in some ways. What do you think about that, Dr. Mills?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it, and I think it's easier for the rest of the population, those of us that were not first responders, right? I think it's important for us to relive that, and certainly that was traumatic for people that just in the general population as well. But I think that's really where you kind of need to be reminded of that this was a real event. I think the one thing, kind of going back to one of the things that you said, Grace, that is disappointing was there was a moment in a period of time right after September 11th. That was I'm a Red Sox fan, so I do not like the New York Yankees, and Grace and I will probably never talk about this ever again.
I don't
But
either.
okay, good. But I remember there was a Yankee game, and George Bush went out there and threw the first pitch, and it was such a powerful moment. And it sounds so silly, but it was this kind of act of a little bit of defiance, like, hey, we're back. But then also it didn't matter whether you hated George Bush or you hated baseball, whatever it was. It's everybody came together, and that was a real symbolic moment, and one that literally people will never forget, whether they like baseball or not, or like George Bush or not. And there was a sense of, wow, this took this horrible tragedy, but maybe kind of brought us all together. And certainly in today's world, 24 years later, that's not the case, and it's really unfortunate. And I think that's one thing that maybe we do need to remind ourselves as well, is that there was this kind of glimmer of hope that did kind of, it was like that proverbial kind of phoenix rising from the ashes moment, where it was like, hey, we're all going to be okay. And there was this kind of collectiveness that was, that we all felt, that we don't feel today. And maybe kind of going through and not forgetting some of these things. It's that concept of like trauma bonding, right? Like that's a real thing. And we
Yes.
did it as an entire country. And unfortunately now I think not that I wish a trauma on us, it's like, but I think we need to revisit some of those feelings and maybe get back to some of that.
Think that the traumas are happening like little tiny cuts, death by a thousand cuts. I
Right.
think the trauma we're witnessing today is that exactly. But Dr. Mills, thank you so much for being here. I can't wait till you're back in November, when it's actually going to be Veterans Week that week, where we're going to talk about your research, and we're bringing on Matt Chenoweth, also from Veterans, the military center that we have at NSU. So I'm really looking forward to that and having you both there. Silent Wounds, an empirical study of PTSD among veterans, and that's November 13th. So thank you again, Dr. Mills, for joining us. I'm going to start doing some shameless plugs now about next week. Next week, we have examination of the influence of a standardized law enforcement curriculum with Dr. Christopher Powell, who's one of our amazing adjuncts, and also a recent graduate of the PhD in criminal justice here at Nova Southeastern University in the College of Education School of Criminal Justice. And he's going to be joined by his chair and mentor, and a guy you all probably know, police psychologist, Dr. Vincent Van Hasselt from the College of Psychology. So he's going to be with us. That whole thing is going to be, we're going to focus on curriculum, police officer, law enforcement curriculum, and the influence that it has and the change that it could make in first responders. Then to round out the end of September, restorative practices in dependency court, also known as Hope Court or the Hope Project, with our very own Dr. Marcelo Castro, and he's going to be joined by Melissa Green and Kira Jackson. So we have some really exciting stuff every single week. All of my students that are here, thank you for joining the webinar. Please make sure that you email Dr. T right at the end of this so that I know that you were here. I'm sorry if we didn't get to everyone, but just knowing that you're in attendance and supporting us was amazing. Thank you so much to Dr. Durham, our dean. Also, thank you to again Dr. Castro and to you again, Dr. Mills. And we'll see you all soon. Stay safe